So hello everybody and welcome to Bioinformatics for Biodiversity. If you've already taken one of my modules, you'll be quite familiar with the layout. With this module, I've split the video up into a couple of sections, purely because it's quite an in-depth video and there's a lot of information to take in, so I've tried to split them up into as smaller chunks as I think is possible. Do feel free to pause at any point and come back. It is a lot of information, I do sympathise. So we'll just get started. So let's start off with what is biodiversity. So biodiversity is short for biological diversity, and it refers to the amount and the variety of organisms living within a population. So a population can be as small as the pond's ecosystem and as large as the planet. So biodiversity is the result of millions of years of evolution. There are three kinds of biodiversity. You've got ecosystem, ecological and genetic. So ecosystem and ecological biodiversity, we'll just look at those in a little bit of detail. So ecosystem biodiversity refers to the amount of different ecosystems present within a region or globally, for example. The Earth has a high ecosystem biodiversity because there are lots of different ecosystems on the Earth. So ecological biodiversity refers to the biodiversity seen in an ecosystem. So for example, the amount of bird species in the Amazon or the number of toucans in the Amazon. So you see it just goes from being quite a broad look to even smaller, and genetic biodiversity is looking even smaller. So genetic biodiversity refers to the amount of genetic variation within a population, often a specific population of a certain species. So for example, the genetic diversity of the toucans in the Amazon. So having a greater genetic diversity in a population, it can increase the chance that the population will be able to adapt to future events. So I call this future proofing. So for example, a higher frequency of potentially disease resistant or heat cold tolerance genes. So you're kind of future-proofing your species. Not every member of that species will have that certain adaptation or certain mutation, but those that do may be able to continue the lineage on if anything drastic happens. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail, don't worry. So genetic diversity decreases as population reduces, and this is often caused by habitat destruction, disease, or environmental changes. Then the frequency of the different genes in the population can change, and some could be lost by the population completely. So this is called a genetic bottleneck, and this can have an impact on future population fitness. So let's pretend that the yellow beads in the bottle are organisms that have resistance to a devastating disease, and the white beads are organisms that have a higher heat tolerance. And let's say the bottleneck is caused by habitat destruction. So here is your original population, and this is the bottlenecking event. So let's say extreme logging or a massive disease came along and potentially decimated the population. This is why we call it a bottleneck, because very few make it through. So we've got one white, one red, and this is through the bottleneck event. So your surviving population is only those with red and white. So we said that yellow beads have the resistance to a devastating disease, and white beads are organisms that have a higher heat tolerance. So we've got three organisms with red and one organism with white, and we've got none of the yellow ones, so we have no disease resistance. So let's say something particularly devastating happened. So their first bottleneck was caused by habitat destruction, logging perhaps, and then next came along a devastating disease that would then absolutely decimate the population because they have no individuals with that adaptation in the population, which could potentially cause extinction. So really having a high genetic biodiversity can really help protect and future-proof that population. So that's just a great example. I know that's it might be a little bit complex. If you are struggling with trying to understand genetic bottlenecks, then do have a look at other resources on the internet. There's a fair few. And if you are still struggling, please do post on the forum and perhaps we can go through it in a little bit more detail, because I know it can be quite complicated. But for now, we'll just move on. So if the genetic diversity keeps decreasing or is very low, an inbreeding depression can occur. So an inbreeding depression is caused when the genetic diversity in a population drops so low that breeding will occur between genetically similar organisms, and that can cause many problems. So this can cause deleterious recessive alleles to be expressed in a population. So this can cause poor offspring health and reduce reproductive rates. So this image here is fantastic because if you take a look, you've got a dominant allele, you've got a recessive allele. And now the recessive allele, of course, you need two copies for it to be expressed. So it's not actually expressed here. So they go on and have offspring, and again, it's still not expressed. You don't have two recessive alleles. And then what they're saying is because inbreeding occurs here between two very genetically similar, they're the same offspring, you end up with the recessive being expressed, which is a deleterious thing. Maybe it is potentially, it causes a problem in some very, very vital function, so that the organism is now far less fit than its other siblings and offspring that don't have this deleterious allele expression going on. Okay, so genetic biodiversity is very important for the future of a population. So here I've just done a quick diagram just to kind of see how it's a little bit of a vicious circle, because let's say decreasing genetic diversity, so this increases the likelihood a population could be decimated by disease or environmental change. The reducing population size goes even further, and this causes a genetic bottleneck, which potentially causes an inbreeding depression, which reduces offspring fitness and reduces reproductive rates, and we can go around in a vicious circle. And this is where a lot of conservation studies do try and aim to increase genetic diversity as one of their first steps to obviously establish a stable population by increasing genetic biodiversity, and then that way they are kind of more future-proofing the population. But why is biodiversity important? So the decline or loss of just one species can have an impact on many other organisms in that ecosystem. An animal's relationship with its environment, and not just animals, all the organisms, is a complex and sensitive one. Many species of animals have timed reproductive cycles, migration, hunting, and feeding with their environment and food source availability. Such an intricate relationship, when unbalanced, has the chance of collapsing, putting species at risk of extinction if they cannot adapt to the new conditions. So in this module, we will go through examples of biodiversity loss and why they are important. You may wish to research your own. You could always look at declining local populations. To do this, you could research local organisms you want to look at and input their names into the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species. It's a fantastic list that I have used for this module and for the evolution module. You type in an organism and it comes up with their status, their conservation plan, and things like this. So we will be going through a couple of examples in this lecture, but if you want to take a look at your own, then do feel free.